Good morning. I'm continuing my series on the First American Congress between Paul Morphy, in the final between Paul Morphy and Louis Paulsen. Here Paulsen has white. Morphy just needs one game to win the First American Congress. Paulsen plays e4, Morphy plays e5. Knight comes to c3, knight comes to c6. And again, Paulsen goes for the more cautious 3 knights as it is at the minute, 4 knights now. I think he's tried the 4 knights Spanish, he's not tried the 4 knights Italian, and now we have the 4 knights Scotch. If there weren't 4 knights, if this knight was not, this would be Italian, bishop here would be Spanish, and pawn here would be Scotch. So they called for the 4 knights variation of those openings. So the knight is pinned. If Paulsen tries to win the pawn here, then Morphy will take the pawn here and exploit the pin on the knight to get his pawn back. Paulsen plays a similar move, but the knight isn't actually pinned yet because the d pawn hasn't moved. But in the end, it has a similar effect, or at least it can have a similar effect. So he takes the pawn whilst he can, and Morphy comes to Paulsen comes to d3 to threaten the queen, back up the bishop, threaten the knight with the queen, and back up the bishop with the queen as well. So he defends the knight with the pawn, and Morphy takes the pawn with the knight, exploiting the pin on the knight. Both sides castle, so the knight isn't any longer pinned. Knight takes pawn can be played. Knight takes knight, sorry, and that's what he does. He takes the knight and it's taken back with the pawn. And he takes with the bishop and takes with the pawn. So now's a good point to stop and evaluate. So the pawn structure to Paulsen is a bit destroyed with the doubled pawns here, and this pawn is probably a bit too far forwards to defend well. This knight here is in a very good position. Alright, he is a move or two behind in development. Paulsen just has to play the bishop into the game and he's finished with development. Morphy has to play the bishop and the queen into the game to be finished with development. But yeah, I would say it's probably about minus 0.3 to Morphy. Let's see what my fishy friend thinks of that assessment. No, it's more. Minus 0.9 almost. So yeah, a better advantage than I thought. Don't like me to underestimate Morphy's advantage, but there you go. Okay, so Morphy to move, plays c6. Supports the d pawn and asks the bishop where it's going to go. Well, bishop has no choice, has to go to a5. And the queen comes to a5, threatens the bishop once more, and it's a fork on the c6 pawn, c3 pawn, so he's winning a pawn. Bishop comes back to b3, and Morphy goes ahead and wins a pawn. He's perfectly willing to swap off queens. But he was also threatening this pawn, so if Paulsen had done nothing, that pawn would fall. But yeah, he defends it with his bishop, and Morphy develops his last piece, and maybe now he's threatening something like knight to... No, he's not threatening that because Morphy just takes the queen. But okay. Yeah. So the pawn is defended by the rook, maybe a little bit unnecessary. Great move by Morphy, saying yeah, you can take that if you want. Then I'm going to take the queen, and when you take back, I'm going to take the knight, and then you're going to have ruined pawns. But Paulsen thinks that you can win a pawn like this because the pawn is no longer defended, but of course that doesn't win him a pawn, it loses him in exchange. Paulsen might have thought he was a good player, he probably didn't miss knight e2, but he might have thought that, okay, it's 6 pawns each and I'm giving up the exchange, but my bishops are well placed, maybe I'm able to get a draw here. But no, not at all. So that's taken and the rook takes and the rook comes to the middle to attack the pawn, and the bishop takes up a great square and supports the pawn. If this was purely an endgame, that wouldn't be a great move because it's leaving this pawn backwards. But actually, he's concentrating on expanding on the queen side to attack that bishop. And he continues with that expansion. Now he's threatening to play a4 and win the bishop. So this play a3 to give the bishop an escape square. And the bishop comes to e6 where it restrains this pawn from moving forward and still holds control over this square. And it means now it's possible for him to play c5 without this pawn hanging. So the rook comes to d1 to stop him playing c5. And the pawn comes instead to b5. And the line is broken open for Morphy. And he's willing to give up that pawn, because if Paulsen takes, Morphy takes the bishop, Paulsen takes the rook, then he gets rook to d1 check, and then he comes to d2, a1 check, and then to a2. So he decides against taking. Oh no, 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 no. If he takes with the bishop, no. Yeah, if he takes with the bishop, then Morphy would have. No, he can't pin the rook, but the bishop, because of the bishop here. No, ignore me. So he wins another pawn. I think it's just a case of clearing up now. So he attacks the bishop, has to be defended by the rook, and the rook doubles up. And the bishop defends the rook, but he comes to e1, a1 anyway. And he comes to b1 because he doesn't want to swap off the rooks. But c2, and Paulsen gives up. Why? If he takes the pawn with the bishop, then Morphy will take the rook, and when the bishop takes the rook back, the other rook will come to a1, pin the bishop to the king, and in that way win a whole rook. And if he takes with the rook, then he'll play rook takes pawn, check, and again he's a whole rook up. Alright, it's opposite coloured bishops, but a whole rook up. The opposite coloured bishops aren't going to have any effect on the result of this game. So Paulsen resigned, and with that, Paul Morphy won the first American Chess Congress, proving that he was definitely the best player in America. Next, his ambition was to go to Europe and prove that he was the best chess player in the world. I'm confident he done that, but you know, the consequences of Morphy's trip to Europe, apart from fantastic chess, were probably not good for Morphy's Morphy's mental health. But I've discussed that before. I'm not going to go into it all again. Just a little note on Paulsen. Not long after this, after his tour to Europe actually, Morphy more or less retired from serious chess and became more and more mentally ill. And after that, Paulsen was definitely the best chess player in America and one of the best chess players in the world as well. You know, in the time before Steinitz, there was Anderson, probably the best, and you know, Paulsen probably second best chess player in the world. But then along came Steinitz, and then both Anderson and Paulsen had to go down a place. So yeah, he was no mug, the player who Morphe handily destroyed here. Yeah, okay. Don't forget to like, subscribe, comment and share my videos. Thanks. Bye.